Picture a wall of ice 2,000 feet tall, higher than any skyscraper, stretching across a valley for miles. Behind it, a lake larger than some modern countries. Water pressing against that frozen barrier with unimaginable force. Now picture that wall breaking all at once. In a matter of hours, more water than exists in all the Great Lakes combined came pouring through, and it reshaped an entire continent. The Missoula floods. They sound like a footnote in geology textbooks, but they were among the largest floods in Earth's history. Walls of water 500 feet high, traveling at highway speeds, carving canyons and moving boulders the size of houses. All happening roughly 15,000 years ago, when humans were already living in North America. If you are settling in for the night, this is the kind of story that belongs in the dark hours. The tale of how quickly landscapes can change, how overnight isn't an exaggeration when you are talking about catastrophic floods, how the ground beneath your feet might hold secrets of ancient violence. Subscribe and stick around. Let's start with what existed before the flood. During the last ice age, a massive glacier called the Cordilleran Ice Sheet covered much of western Canada and parts of the northern United States. One lobe of this glacier pushed down into what is now northern Idaho, blocking a river valley. Behind that ice dam, water began to accumulate. Rivers that normally flowed west found their path blocked. A lake formed and grew and kept growing. At its maximum, glacial Lake Missoula held roughly 500 cubic miles of water. Try to imagine that. 500 cubic miles. It is almost impossible. The lake covered an area of about 3,000 square miles. Its surface sat at an elevation of over 4,000 feet. The water was cold, fed by glacial melt and mountain runoff, and it was deep, over 2,000 feet deep in places, an inland sea created by accident, held in place by ice that couldn't last forever. Ice dams are inherently unstable. Water is denser than ice. As the lake deepened, pressure on the dam increased. Water began to seep through cracks in the ice. The seeping water melted channels. The channels grew larger, and at some point, a threshold was crossed. When an ice dam fails, it fails catastrophically. The initial breach allows more water through, which widens the breach, which allows more water, which widens it further. Positive feedback that turns a trickle into a torrent in hours. Once it started, nothing could stop it. The entire contents of glacial Lake Missoula drained in approximately 48 hours 500 cubic miles of water. 2 days. The flow rate at the peak of the flood has been estimated at 10 times the combined flow of all rivers on Earth. That number is so large, it barely registers as meaningful. The water roared west across what is now eastern Washington. It had no established channel to follow, no riverbed shaped over millions of years. It simply overwhelmed everything in its path, creating its own path as it went, stripping away soil, carving into bedrock, rearranging the landscape with brutal efficiency. The channeled scablands are what is left, a region of eastern Washington that looks like nothing else on Earth. Massive dry channels carved into solid basalt, waterfalls that haven't flowed for 15,000 years. Pothole lakes filling depressions scoured by swirling debris, a landscape that makes no sense until you understand what created it. For decades, Geologists refused to believe what they were seeing. The channeled scablands were discovered by J. Harlan Bretz in the 1920s. He proposed that they were created by a catastrophic flood. His colleagues thought he was crazy. The problem was that catastrophic floods violated the dominant geological thinking of the time. Uniformitarianism held that landscapes were shaped by slow, gradual processes. The same processes we see today, acting over millions of years. Sudden catastrophes seemed unscientific. They smelled of biblical floods and religious mythology. Bretz spent decades defending his theory against establishment opposition. He was ridiculed at conferences. His papers were rejected. Prominent geologists dismissed him as a crank who was setting back the profession. Science, it turns out, can be as resistant to new ideas as any other human institution, but the evidence was overwhelming. The channeled scablands couldn't be explained by gradual erosion. The features were too large, too violent, too clearly the product of flowing water at impossible scales. One by one, geologists visited the region and came away convinced. Bretz was right. In 1979, the Geological Society of America officially acknowledged Bretz's contribution. He was 96 years old. He reportedly said that he had lived long enough to see his enemies become his eulogizers. Science eventually corrects itself, but sometimes it takes a lifetime. Now let's talk about what the flood actually did. The water leaving Lake Missoula accelerated to speeds estimated at 65 miles per h-hour. Walls of water, hundreds of feet high, moved across the landscape faster than a person could run. Escape would have been impossible. The flood carried everything it encountered. Icebergs carved from the failing dam, boulders torn from mountainsides, trees, soil, animals. Anything that could float or be pushed along was incorporated into a churning mass of debris that added to the flood's destructive power. When the flood reached obstacles it couldn't go around, it went through them or over them. The water topped ridges hundreds of feet high, pouring over into adjacent valleys. It carved new channels through solid rock in hours. Processes that normally take millions of years happened in an afternoon. One of the most dramatic features is Dry Falls. Today it is a massive horseshoe-shaped cliff in eastern Washington. 3.5 miles wide, 400 feet tall. During the flood, it was a waterfall larger than any that exists today. 5 times wider than Niagara. Twice as tall, water pouring over at unimaginable volumes. Today, Dry Falls is silent. No water has flowed over it for 15,000 years. But the evidence of what happened is written in the rock. The plunge pools, the columnar basalt columns snapped like twigs, the debris fields stretching downstream. A frozen moment of geological violence. The flood didn't stop in Washington. It continued west, filling the Columbia River Gorge to depths of over 1,000 feet. The narrow gorge couldn't accommodate the flow. Water backed up and spread across the landscape, creating temporary lakes wherever it was constricted. Eventually, the water reached the Pacific Ocean. But even there, the scale was staggering. Sediment from the flood spread across the ocean floor, creating deposits that have been traced hundreds of miles offshore. The Pacific itself was affected by fresh water and debris from a lake in Montana. And here is the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. It didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly. perhaps 40 times over a period of 2,000 years. Each time the ice advanced, it dammed the valley. Each time the lake filled, the dam eventually broke. Each time, the flood reshaped the landscape again. 40 floods, each one capable of destroying a modern civilization. Each one releasing more water than humans have ever seen flow at once. Each one leaving its mark on a landscape that accumulated the evidence of repeated catastrophe. The channeled scablands aren't the record of one event. They're the record of dozens. The evidence for multiple floods comes from careful geological analysis. Different flood deposits can be distinguished by their composition. Some floods were larger than others. Some came from different directions as the ice sheet shifted. The pattern is complex but clear. This happened over and over. Consider what this meant for anything living in the flood path. Every few decades, without warning, the landscape would be scoured clean. Animals that had recolonized after the previous flood would be swept away. Plants that had taken root would be uprooted. The recovery would begin, only to be interrupted by the next catastrophe. And humans were there. We know that people lived in North America 15,000 years ago. The Clovis culture and its predecessors. They hunted mammoths and mastodons. They made sophisticated stone tools, and some of them must have lived in the flood zone. Did any of them witness a flood? Did any of them survive to tell the story? We have no direct evidence. But consider the scale: walls of water 500 feet high, moving at highway speeds, appearing with little to no warning. If you were in the path, you died. If you weren't, you might have seen it from a distance and lived to wonder what had happened. Some researchers believe that oral traditions among Pacific Northwest tribes might carry echoes of the Missoula floods, stories of great floods that reshaped the land, of waters that rose impossibly high, of destruction that seemed supernatural in scale. Could these be memories preserved for 15,000 years? It sounds unlikely. 15,000 years is a long time for any story to survive. But the floods were so dramatic, so unprecedented, that they would have been the most significant events any witness had ever experienced. Such events demand explanation. Demand storytelling. Demand memory. Whether or not oral traditions preserve flood memories, the geological record is clear. The floods happened. They were among the largest flood events in Earth's history, and they transformed a landscape in ways that are still visible today, 15 millennia later. If you are still with me, consider what the Missoula floods tell us about geological time. We tend to think of landscapes as permanent. Mountains have always been there. Rivers have always flowed in their current channels. The ground beneath our feet seems solid and unchanging, but the Missoula floods remind us that change can be sudden, catastrophic, complete. A landscape that took millions of years to form can be reshaped in hours. The slow processes of erosion and deposition can be overwhelmed by single events of sufficient magnitude. This is what Bretz understood, and his critics couldn't accept. Catastrophes happen. They're part of how Earth works. Not the only part, but an important part. Gradualism and catastrophism aren't opposites. They're both true. The Earth is shaped by slow processes interrupted by sudden violence. The Missoula floods also remind us that the past was stranger than we imagine. During the Ice Age, North America was a different world. Glaciers miles thick, lakes larger than modern seas, animals that dwarf anything alive today, and floods that would make modern disasters look trivial. We live in a relatively calm period. The ice has retreated. The mega floods have stopped. The giant animals are gone. The world has settled into a pattern that seems normal to us because it is all we've known. But it is not the way Earth always is. It is just the way Earth is right now. Could something like the Missoula floods happen again? Probably not in exactly the same way. The ice sheets that created them no longer exist, but the principle remains. Dams can break, lakes can drain catastrophically, landscapes can be reshaped overnight. Today we have artificial dams holding back reservoirs far smaller than Lake Missoula. But even those can cause devastating floods when they fail. The Banqiao Dam collapse in China in 1975 killed over 170,000 people. Catastrophic floods remain possible in our modern world, and climate change is creating new possibilities for catastrophic floods. Glacial lakes are forming as ice melts. Some of these lakes are dammed by unstable moraines that could fail suddenly. The conditions that created the Missoula floods no longer exist, but similar conditions might emerge. But let's return to the channeled scablands themselves, because visiting them is like walking through a crime scene 15,000 years cold. The evidence is everywhere, written in basalt columns, carved into canyon walls, scattered across the landscape in boulders that have no business being where they are. The giant ripple marks are among the most striking features. Ordinary river ripples are measured in inches. The Missoula flood ripples are measured in tens of feet. They stretch for miles across the landscape, frozen waves of gravel, deposited by water moving so fast that normal physics barely applied. Then there are the erratics. Boulders carried by icebergs within the flood, dropped when the ice melted. Some of these rocks are the size of houses. They sit on landscapes where they clearly don't belong, geological strangers left behind by an event that ended millennia ago. The bar deposits are equally impressive. Gravel bars hundreds of feet thick, deposited where the flood slowed enough to drop its load. These aren't ordinary river bars. They're mountains of debris accumulated in hours, testimony to the volume of material the flood was carrying. And the coulees. These are deep canyons carved into the basalt. Dry now but obviously shaped by flowing water. Some are hundreds of feet deep, miles long. They don't connect to any current drainage. They exist because water once flowed through them at volumes that defy imagination. Walking through the scablands, you are walking through proof that the world can change faster than we expect. That landscapes we think of as permanent can be reshaped in hours. That the ground beneath our feet holds secrets of violence we can barely comprehend. If you are drifting off now, let that thought settle into your dreams, not as a nightmare but as wonder. The earth is more dynamic than we usually remember, more capable of sudden change, more full of history written in rock and gravel and the shapes of canyons. The ice dam that broke held back a lake for thousands of years. Then, in hours, everything changed. The lake was gone. The dam was gone, and a new landscape was being created by forces that humans couldn't have stopped or even understood if they had witnessed them. But life returned. It always does. The scablands today support plants and animals that have no memory of the floods. Fish swim in lakes that fill the scoured depressions. Birds nest on cliffs carved by ancient torrents. The violence is over. The healing continues. And humans returned too. Native peoples lived in the scablands for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. They fished in the lakes, hunted on the plains, made their homes in a landscape shaped by catastrophe, but perfectly livable in the aftermath. Today, the scablands are agricultural land. Mostly, wheat fields stretch across the flood deposits. Irrigation brings water to land that hasn't seen a natural flood for 15 millennia. Farmers work soil enriched by debris carried from Montana in a torrent they can barely imagine. The story of the Missoula floods is ultimately a story of change. Dramatic, sudden, overwhelming change, but also change that ends, that allows recovery. That becomes the foundation for new life and new landscapes. We live in a world shaped by events we didn't witness. The Missoula floods are just one example. Asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, ice ages, and interglacials. The Earth has been through more than we can easily imagine, and yet here we are. That is not a reason for fear. It is a reason for perspective. The challenges we face today are real and significant, but they're not unprecedented. Life has survived worse. The Earth has endured more. The capacity for recovery is built into how the planet works. The ice dam that broke didn't end the world. It reshaped part of it, violently, dramatically, in ways that are still visible today. But the reshaping ended. The violence passed, and what was left became the foundation for everything that came after. Maybe there is comfort in that. The knowledge that even the most dramatic changes eventually stabilize, that catastrophes, however overwhelming, are temporary, that the world after is different from the world before, but it is still a world, still capable of supporting life, still capable of beauty. The channeled scablands are beautiful now, strange and stark and unlike anywhere else on Earth, but beautiful. The violence that created them is gone. What remains is a landscape that tells a story to anyone willing to read it. Brett spent his life reading that story, fighting to have it accepted, waiting decades for vindication. And when it finally came, he had the satisfaction of knowing he'd been right all along. The flood happened. The evidence was real. The landscape told the truth. We can read the story too, not with Brett's expertise, but with his wonder. The sense of awe that comes from contemplating forces beyond human scale. The humility that comes from recognizing how small we are against the backdrop of geological time. And maybe that is the best lesson from the Missoula floods. Not fear of catastrophe, not anxiety about forces we can't control, but perspective, the understanding that we're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, that the Earth has stories to tell if we're willing to listen. So rest now. Let the flood waters recede in your imagination. Let the ice dam be whole again, holding back its impossible lake. Let the scablands be smooth and uncarved, waiting for the violence that will shape them. In your sleep, 15,000 years will pass in an instant. The floods will come and go. The landscape will be carved and healed. Life will return and thrive. And you'll wake to a world that carries those ancient events in its bones, invisible but real. Thanks for spending this time with the Missoula floods, with the ice dam that broke and reshaped a continent, with the geologist who spent his life proving what everyone else denied. It is quite a story, one of Earth's greatest. Subscribe and stick around for more journeys into the forces that shaped our world. More stories of sudden change and gradual recovery. More evidence that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets worth knowing. Sleep well tonight. The ice dam is long gone. The floods have stopped. The world is calm, at least for now. And the channeled scablands wait silently, ready to tell their story to anyone who visits. Ready to remind us that change can come faster than we imagine. Good night from Lake Missoula, which no longer exists. From the ice dam, which melted away thousands of years ago. From the flood path, which is now farmland and sagebrush, and a landscape that remembers violence in its very shape. The ice dam that broke. North America reshaped overnight. Proof that the world can change faster than we think, and proof that after the change, life goes on. It always does. Good night. But before you drift away completely, there is more to this story worth exploring. The Missoula floods weren't just geological events. They were part of a larger pattern of Ice Age catastrophes that shaped the world we inherited. During the last Ice Age, similar floods happened in other parts of the world. When glacial lakes formed behind ice dams or moraines, they created potential for sudden drainage. The same physics that emptied Lake Missoula emptied lakes across Europe and Asia. In Europe, the Ice Age produced floods from lakes trapped behind retreating glaciers. The Baltic ice lake drained catastrophically multiple times as the Scandinavian ice sheet melted. Each drainage sent massive floods through what is now the North Sea. In Asia, glacial lake outburst floods carved valleys in the Himalayas and surrounding ranges. These floods continue today as climate change creates new glacial lakes behind unstable natural dams. The same processes that created the scablands are happening right now in the world's highest mountains. The Missoula floods fit into this global pattern of Ice Age violence. The Earth was emerging from glaciation. Ice was melting. Lakes were forming and draining. Landscapes across the Northern Hemisphere were being reshaped by water released from frozen storage. And somewhere in all of this, humans were spreading across the world, following the retreating ice, colonizing newly exposed landscapes, hunting megafauna that would soon go extinct, living through environmental changes that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone experiencing them. The timing is remarkable. Humans arrived in North America roughly at the same time the Missoula floods were happening. The first Americans were crossing the land bridge from Asia while ice dams were forming and breaking in Montana. They entered a continent in transformation. What did they make of the evidence they found? The carved canyons, the massive boulders, the landscapes that looked like something violent had passed through. Did they recognize flood evidence? Did they incorporate it into their understanding of the world? We can't know for certain, but humans are pattern seekers, storytellers, explainers. Faced with evidence of catastrophic change, they would have tried to understand it. would have created narratives that made sense of what they saw, would have passed those narratives down through generations. Some researchers have suggested that Native American flood stories might preserve memories of the Missoula floods or similar events. Stories of world-destroying floods appear in cultures throughout the Pacific Northwest. Stories of landscapes transformed by water. Stories of survival against impossible odds. These stories are hard to date. They've been told and retold for countless generations. Details change. Locations shift. The core narrative persists while the specifics evolve. But the persistence of flood narratives in cultures that lived near the scablands is at least suggestive. Of course, flood stories are common worldwide. Not all of them can trace back to real floods. Humans live near water. Floods happen. Stories accumulate. The universal nature of flood mythology might just reflect the universal experience of living in flood-prone areas. But the Missoula floods were different in scale. Not ordinary flooding that happens every few years. Catastrophic flooding that happens once in thousands of lifetimes. The kind of event that would demand special explanation, that would generate stories unlike ordinary flood tales. Whether or not oral traditions preserve specific memories. The floods left physical evidence that would have been obvious to anyone who looked. The scablands are unmistakably shaped by water. Anyone walking through them would recognize the carved channels, the ripple marks, the waterfalls that no longer fall. Native peoples lived in this landscape for thousands of years. They hunted in the coulees, fished in the pothole lakes, made their homes in a terrain that told stories of ancient violence in every curve and channel. The landscape itself was a memory. When European settlers arrived, they too noticed the strange landscape, but they lacked the framework to understand it. The scablands were labeled as worthless scrubland. The carved channels were mysteries to be ignored. The evidence of catastrophic flooding went unrecognized for decades. It took Brett's, an outsider with fresh eyes, to see what was obvious once you looked properly. The landscape screamed flood. Every feature pointed to water at impossible volumes. But you had to be willing to see catastrophe as possible. Most geologists of his era weren't. The resistance to Bretz's theory tells us something important about how science works, and how it sometimes doesn't work. Paradigms shape perception. If you believe landscapes are shaped by gradual processes, you literally can't see evidence of sudden change. Your framework filters it out. Brett's didn't have that filter. He came to the scablands expecting to find evidence of gradual erosion. What he found instead was evidence of catastrophe, and unlike his colleagues, he was willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. That willingness cost him decades of professional credibility, but it also led him to truth. The floods happened. The evidence was real. The landscape didn't lie. Eventually, science caught up to what the rocks had always been saying. There is a parallel here to how we process information about change in general. We tend to expect gradual change because that is what we usually experience. Day follows day, season follows season. The world seems stable because it changes slowly enough to seem constant. But sometimes change is sudden. Sometimes the ice dam breaks. Sometimes the flood comes. And our expectations of gradual change leave us unprepared for catastrophe. The Missoula floods remind us that not all change respects our expectations. This is relevant to thinking about climate change today. We expect gradual warming, rising sea levels, shifting weather patterns, but climate systems have tipping points, thresholds beyond which change accelerates, the potential for sudden shifts that overwhelm gradual adaptation. The ice dam that held back Lake Missoula seemed permanent. For thousands of years it held, and then, in hours, it failed. The lake that had accumulated over centuries drained in days. The gradual became sudden without warning. We can't predict exactly when tipping points will be reached, but we know they exist. The Missoula floods prove that Earth systems can shift suddenly. That stability is an illusion maintained until it isn't. That change can come faster than we imagine possible. But the Missoula floods also prove something else, that after sudden change, recovery happens. The scablands were scoured to bare rock, and then life returned, plants colonized the debris, animals followed. Eventually, humans made homes there. The violence ended, the healing began. This is the full lesson of the Missoula floods. Not just that catastrophe happens, but that catastrophe passes. Not just that change can be sudden, but that sudden change can be survived. Not just that landscapes can be destroyed, but that destroyed landscapes can be reborn. The channeled scablands today are evidence of both destruction and recovery. The carved canyons speak of violence. The grass and trees speak of healing. The farms speak of human adaptation. The landscape holds both memories, the trauma, and the recovery together. Maybe that is the most important thing to carry into sleep tonight. The knowledge that even the worst changes eventually end. That recovery is possible even after catastrophe. That the world after is different from the world before. But it is still a world worth living in. The ice dam that broke reshaped North America. But it didn't end North America. The floods carved new landscapes. But those landscapes became homes for new life. The catastrophe was real. The recovery was equally real. Both are part of the story. And you are part of this story too. You live on a continent shaped by those floods. You benefit from soils enriched by flood deposits. You drink water that still flows through channels carved by ancient torrents. The Missoula floods are part of your environment, even if you never visit the scablands. Every continent has similar stories. Catastrophic events that shaped the land long before humans kept records. Floods, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, impacts. The earth has been violent many times, and life has persisted through all of it. That persistence is remarkable. 4 billion years of life on Earth, countless catastrophes, and still life continues. Still ecosystems recover. Still new species evolve to fill the gaps left by extinctions. The resilience is almost incomprehensible. The Missoula floods are a small part of that story. Dramatic on human timescales, footnotes on planetary timescales, but they're a part we can see clearly, where we can trace the evidence, where we can reconstruct what happened and marvel at the scale. That is a privilege. To be able to read the landscape like a book, to see the evidence of ancient catastrophe preserved in rock and gravel, to understand what happened here 15,000 years ago, to connect with forces that operated before humans kept any records at all. Brett gave us this privilege. His decades of work, his persistence against opposition, his willingness to follow evidence wherever it led. Because of him, we can visit the scablands and know what we're seeing. We can stand at dry falls and imagine the waterfall that once roared there. That imagination is its own kind of time travel. Standing in a dry canyon, seeing the flood that carved it, walking across giant ripples, feeling the water that deposited them, touching boulders that rode icebergs through torrents that no longer exist. The past becomes present through understanding, and that understanding enriches the present. Knowing that landscapes have histories makes them more interesting, more meaningful, more worthy of attention and care. The scablands aren't just scrubland, they're testimony to one of Earth's greatest floods. Every landscape has similar stories if we know how to read them. The scablands are dramatic and obvious. Other landscapes are subtler. But the Earth has been shaping and reshaping itself for billions of years. Every place we stand holds stories of change. That is a good thought to fall asleep with. The knowledge that we live in a world full of stories, that the ground beneath us has witnessed wonders we can barely imagine, that catastrophe and recovery have shaped everything we see, even if we don't usually notice. Tomorrow you'll walk on ground shaped by forces you didn't witness. You'll breathe air that has been transformed countless times by volcanic eruptions and photosynthesis and ice ages. You'll be part of a world that has been catastrophically changed and has recovered over and over again. That is not a burden. It is a gift. The chance to be part of something ancient and ongoing, to inherit what previous catastrophes created, to live in the aftermath of changes that made our existence possible. The ice dam that broke North America reshaped overnight. A continent transformed by water. A landscape that still tells the story to anyone willing to listen. That is what you've spent this evening with. That is what you'll carry into your dreams. Thanks for listening. Thanks for wondering. Thanks for being part of the long human tradition of looking at the world and asking what happened here. Brett's asked that question. His answer changed how we understand Earth's history. Maybe you'll ask similar questions someday. Maybe you'll notice something everyone else missed. Maybe you'll follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. That is how knowledge grows. One stubborn questioner at a time. Sleep well. Dream of ice and water and landscapes being born. Dream of floods that dwarf anything you've ever seen. Dream of a world that can change faster than you imagine and recover more completely than you'd hope. The Missoula floods are over, have been for 15,000 years, but their story lives on in rock and gravel and the shape of canyons. And now it lives in you too, another carrier of the knowledge, another link in the chain of understanding. Good night from the Channel Scablands, from Lake Missoula's ghost, from the ice dam that held and then didn't, from the flood that changed a continent. May your rest be peaceful, even as you carry stories of ancient violence. Good night. Actually, there is one more aspect of this story that deserves attention before you sleep. The Missoula floods weren't just about destruction. They were about creation too, about new landscapes being born from the death of old ones. Consider what the floods created. The Columbia River Gorge, carved deeper and wider than natural erosion alone could achieve. Multnomah Falls, fed by streams that flow over cliffs shaped by floodwaters. The Willamette Valley, enriched by sediments, deposited when the floods backed up behind narrow passages. The Willamette Valley is particularly interesting. When the floods reached the narrow passage near modern-day Portland, they backed up water spread across what is now some of the most fertile agricultural land in Oregon. And when the floods receded, they left behind layers of rich sediment. Today, the Willamette Valley produces wine grapes, hazelnuts, berries, and dozens of other crops. The fertility of that land comes partly from the Missoula floods, ancient catastrophe becoming modern abundance, violence becoming the foundation for plenty. The same pattern appears throughout the flood zone. Pothole lakes that now support fish and wildlife. Gravel deposits that became commercial quarries. Exposed basalt that reveals the geology of ancient volcanic flows. The floods didn't just destroy, they revealed and created and transformed, and they created mystery. The strange landscape of the scablands puzzled observers for decades. The mystery drew researchers. The research led to discovery. The discovery changed how we understand Earth's history. Without the mystery, we might never have learned to see catastrophe in the geological record. Bretz's work on the scablands opened doors that have never closed. Once geologists accepted that catastrophic floods were possible, they started seeing evidence of them elsewhere. The Altai floods in Siberia, the Bonneville flood in Utah. Similar events around the world that had been overlooked because catastrophe seemed impossible. Even the extinction of the dinosaurs, now attributed to asteroid impact, became easier to accept once geologists had absorbed the lesson of the scablands. Catastrophes happen. They shape Earth's history. They're not just mythology or religious fantasy. They're real forces that leave real evidence. This might be Bretz's greatest legacy. Not just proving the Missoula floods happened, but changing how scientists think about change itself. Before Bretz, catastrophe was almost taboo in geology. After Bretz, it became part of the toolkit, a possible explanation to be considered rather than dismissed. And this matters for how we think about the future. If catastrophes are possible, if rapid change can happen, then we need to be prepared for it. Not just gradual adaptation to gradual change, but readiness for sudden shifts that overwhelm normal processes. The Missoula floods happened because an ice dam failed. Modern dams fail too. They're better engineered than ice dams, but they're not immune to failure. When they fail, the consequences can be catastrophic. The physics of dam failure doesn't care whether the dam is ice or concrete. And there are other potential sources of sudden change. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, climate tipping points. The Earth has many ways of changing suddenly. The Missoula floods are just one example from a long list of possibilities. Understanding these possibilities isn't about fear. It is about wisdom. The people who lived through the Missoula floods didn't have warning. They couldn't have prepared. We're in a different position. We can see some of the risks ahead. We can study the evidence of past catastrophes. We can try to be ready. That is one of the gifts the Missoula floods offer. Not just knowledge of the past, but wisdom for the future. The understanding that change can come suddenly, that landscapes we think of as permanent can be transformed overnight. That preparation matters even for events we think are unlikely. But let's not end on anxiety. Let's end where we started. With wonder, the Missoula floods were among the largest floods in Earth's history. They reshaped a significant portion of North America. They created landscapes of strange and austere beauty. They left a puzzle that took decades to solve. That is wonderful. In the original sense of the word, full of wonder. The world is more dramatic than we usually realize, more capable of sudden change, more full of history written in rock and gravel, more interesting than a world of purely gradual change could ever be. The channeled scablands are still there. You could visit them tomorrow, walk the dry coulees, stand at dry falls, see the giant ripple marks, touch boulders that rode icebergs through torrents larger than any modern river. The evidence is waiting. The story is ready to be read. And even if you never visit, you know the story now. You've traveled there in imagination. You've seen the ice dam and the lake and the catastrophic drainage. You've watched a landscape being born from violence. You've traced the evidence through 15,000 years. That knowledge is yours now. Part of your understanding of the world, a lens for seeing landscapes differently, a reminder that the ground beneath your feet has stories to tell, that everything we see is the result of processes, gradual and sudden, that shaped it into what it is. 15,000 years ago, no human could have predicted the Missoula floods. No one knew the ice dam was weakening. No one saw the catastrophe coming. And then, in hours, everything changed. A continent was reshaped. Landscapes were created and destroyed. Life was swept away and would slowly return. We live in the aftermath of that change. The scablands are part of our world now. The Columbia Gorge carries water through channels carved by ancient floods. The Willamette Valley grows food in soil deposited by backed-up floodwaters. The catastrophe is woven into the world we inherited, and we carry the story now too. Passed from those ancient witnesses, if there were any, through oral traditions and geological research, through scientific papers and late-night videos, through generation after generation of humans trying to understand their world. The story continues through us. Tomorrow the scablands will still be there. The evidence will still be legible. The story will still be waiting. And somewhere, maybe, someone will visit and see it fresh. Will feel the wonder that Brett's felt. Will understand, really understand, what happened here. That continuity is precious. The passing of knowledge from generation to generation, the accumulation of understanding over time, the way each person who learns the story becomes a carrier of it, responsible for passing it on. You are part of that chain now. You've heard the story of the ice dam that broke, of the flood that reshaped a continent, of the geologist who fought for decades to have his discovery accepted, of the landscape that still bears witness to ancient violence. Carry it well, share it when appropriate. Remember it when you see strange landscapes. Think of it when someone tells you change can only be gradual. The ice dam that broke proves otherwise, and the scablands remember. The scablands remember. And now, so do you. Good night. Sleep well. Dream of ice and water and landscapes being transformed. Dream of evidence waiting to be read. Dream of stories passing through time. Dream of a world more interesting than we usually let ourselves notice. The ice dam that broke North America. Reshaped overnight. Now part of your story forever. Good night.